I am a 25-year-old guy. A few Thanksgivings back, when I was still in college, my family was hosting Thanksgiving at our house like we always did. Typically, about 15 to 20 family members would all come over to our house. Before dinner, we hung out, had football on the TV, and had some snacks out. My older sister had just recently got engaged to her now husband Mark, and I've always been a bit of an amateur photographer, so the three of us went outside to take some photos. It was a perfect day and time for photographs because it had just begun to lightly snow and the sun was sort of peeking out of the clouds. It looked pretty cool. We went out to our backyard, which was fairly large. There was several acres of land back there with a shed and a pretty big woods. We went to the entrance of the woods, which was kind of our family photo spot, and I began taking pictures of them. We went to several other places in the yard and were outside for about 20 minutes and then came back inside. We looked over the photos briefly, and then it was time for dinner, where we had turkey and potatoes and all that good stuff. A little later that night, when we were all relaxing and watching some football, we decided to go over the photos again with a couple of my aunts to see. I have to admit that most of the photos were really good, but when we got to the ones in front of the woods, we noticed something. In 3 photos, in the window of the shed in the background, we could see what appeared to be a man's face looking at the camera. We had completely missed this the first couple times we had looked. It was a pretty creepy sight to see, and my sister couldn't believe it. We weren't able to make out much details of the man because of how far away he was, but we could only see his head in the window. We showed the pictures to my dad, who decided to go out to the shed with 2 of my uncles. They were all pretty large men, and said they were confident they could take whoever it was, but we still didn't know who the man was or if he was dangerous or not. We also didn't know if he would still be in the shed. Many of us watched from the window as my dad and 2 uncles walked out of our house towards the shed. When they got there, they opened the door, and I saw all 3 of them go inside. Then we saw briefly a man run out and try to hit one of my uncles, but was soon overpowered and shoved back into the shed. My dad and uncles then shut the door and all stood in front of it to block it. They signaled to us that the man was still in fact inside and yelled for us to call the police while they held the door shut so the man couldn't escape. My aunt had already called the police, and about 5 minutes later they showed up and arrested the man. He was a dirty looking guy who for some reason had wandered into our yard and decided to live in our shed for a whole 2 days. It made for a very memorable Thanksgiving. This story occurred many years ago. It was probably the early 2000s at the time, and I was about 5 or 6 years old. The Thanksgiving tradition for my family is to go to my Uncle Rob and Aunt Carrie's house. They have a pretty nice place about 30 minutes away, and it's a middle point for lots of our family to meet. I remember that year we had a big family 2-hand touch football game outside. It was really fun, but I was too young and too little to participate, so I stood around and watched with the rest of the family. As I was watching the game, my Uncle Rob's neighbor John came up to me and started talking with me. John would also be at our family get-togethers sometimes, because he would often just stop by and say hi, and then end up staying for a while. I didn't know much about him, but he always just seemed a little bit strange to me. He was probably in his 50s and had grayish hair and wore large glasses. He asked me several questions about football and who my favorite players were and stuff, and then talked with me about some other things. I remember then he asked me if I wanted to see his house. I didn't really want to, but he was really persuasive and kept telling me that I had to see it. So finally, I said okay, and then we got up and we walked back to the front of the house and then down the driveway. We walked down the street into his house, which was maybe a 10-minute walk away. When we got there, I saw his house, which was an older, more beat-up looking house. He let me in the front door, and the first thing I smelled was a strong, musty smell. The house was pretty messy, and I didn't really know what we were doing there. He told me to sit on the couch, so I did, and he turned on the TV. I remember watching football on TV for a little while he sat across from me in his chair. We did that for maybe 10 or 15 minutes until the front door suddenly opened. It was my Uncle Rob. He looked really surprised to see me and asked us what we were doing. John then stood up and told my Uncle Rob that I had been begging him to take me to his house. He said that I had to go back, and then I went back to Rob's. John stayed there. I really don't know why John invited me over to his house that day, but after that Thanksgiving, I never saw or heard anything about him again. A few years back, my family was preparing to host Thanksgiving at our house for the 5th year in a row. We were expecting many guests, so we decided to buy a lot of food. I was a junior or senior in high school at the time, and I worked at an electronics store. It was the night before Thanksgiving, and my mother asked me to pick up some more food last minute on my way home from work. I stopped at Walmart, which was very busy. I went inside and got all of the things that my mother had asked for, which took me longer than I had expected because of all the people that were there. When I was done, I walked back to my car and put the groceries inside of it. When I did, I noticed there was a car parked next to me with several people in it in the parking lot. As soon as I got near my car, it started up. I didn't pay much attention to it, and I started my engine and drove away. The car left at the exact same time as me and remained behind me for quite some time. It was a typical looking car, maybe a little bit old, and was black. I only lived about 5 to 10 minutes away from the store and made it back pretty quickly. I was slightly concerned though when I turned onto my street and saw the car turn on as well. I figured it was a coincidence and I pulled into my driveway, but when I did, I noticed the car stopped on the street in front of my house. I went inside and unpacked the groceries and then went back to the window to see if the car was still there. Sure enough, it was, and that's when I told my parents and older brother about it. They said they wanted to go outside and confront whoever it was, so they walked outside, but as soon as they made it out the front door, the car drove away. Relieved, I went back and helped my mother prepare some of the food for the next day. Later on that night though, as I was about to go to sleep, I heard 2 very loud bangs at the front door. It was very startling. Several of us walked over to the window, but by the time we got there, we didn't see anything at all. We stayed on alert for a few minutes, but eventually we all decided to try to go to bed. I was able to finally fall asleep, but was awakened not much longer at 2 a.m. to hear the sound of a banging noise coming from outside. I got out of bed and walked out to the living room. I saw my parents standing in the hallway and heard my mom say she was calling the police. I went to the window and saw 2 people banging on the window of our car in the driveway. Before long, one of the windows broke. They kept banging on the windows as the glass kept shattering, and then they went inside the car. My dad ran to the front door and opened it a crack and shouted that he had called the police. They didn't seem fazed though and remained inside the car. When I looked to the street, sure enough, the same black car that had been following me was parked across from us again. A couple of minutes later, the police arrived. They quickly ran to the car in our driveway and arrested the 2 people. We were all very relieved when that happened. I have no clue why those people chose to target us and break into our car, other than that they were completely insane. We ended up staying up until 3 that morning, but nevertheless, it ended up being a really good Thanksgiving the next day.